She belongs to you now." Winona was sold for $2 while the whole town of Red Creek laughed, but she would save every life in it before the winter ended. No one standing in that cold, tired street believed the trader's mocking words would matter beyond that morning. A struggling rancher named Amos Redfield had ridden in only to trade grain for supplies, and he walked out instead with a stranger nobody wanted and 2 silver coins less in his pocket. By the time the snow came, the very voices that had jeered at him that day would be begging this woman for her wisdom. Stay with me through this one, because it does not end where you expect it to. A rancher with barely enough to keep his own roof standing through the coming season. A woman the whole town decided, in one cruel joke, was worth less than the price of a meal. A blizzard that would test every soul in Red Creek and prove, before it was through, exactly who deserved to be trusted and who did not. I will give you every piece of what happened between that gray autumn morning and the spring that followed it, so settle in, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Before we go any further, I want to ask something small of you. If stories like Winona's mean something to you, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a member of this channel. It costs you nothing tonight, and it keeps stories like this one coming. The first cold wind of late autumn swept down off the mountains and through the streets of Red Creek, a town that had once been busy and generous and had grown quiet, wary, and thin with worry. 2 seasons of poor harvests had done what hard winters alone could not manage. They had made kindness scarce. Doors that used to stand open now stayed shut against the cold and against strangers alike. Neighbors, who had once shared their tables freely, now counted their own grain twice before handing a portion to anyone else, and a town that had prided itself on looking after its own had slowly, quietly, stopped believing it could still afford to. The general store kept shorter hours. The church social that used to mark the start of every winter had been quietly skipped 2 years running, no one quite willing to say out loud that it was because there was little left worth celebrating. It was into this careful, frightened place that Amos Redfield rode one gray morning, leading a wagon of grain he hoped to trade for nails, salt, and whatever coin remained once the trading was done. Amos was not a wealthy man, and he had never once pretended otherwise. His spread sat 3 miles beyond the edge of town, a modest cabin and a leaning barn, on land that gave him just enough to get by in an ordinary year, and a good deal less in a hard one. His father had built the place with his own hands and died on it 2 winters back, leaving Amos to run it alone with nothing but a strong back, a stubborn streak, and the kind of quiet reputation a man earns by keeping his word and showing up when a neighbor's roof needs mending, even when his own could use the same attention first. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of fence work, patient and unshowy by nature, quick to notice things other men missed entirely, and long since resigned to the fact that Red Creek would never hand him anything he did not go out and earn for himself, one trade at a time. His mother had died when he was young enough that he barely remembered her voice, only the shape of the songs she used to hum while she worked, and he had grown up believing that a person's worth showed itself in the small, unglamorous choices nobody else was watching, mending a stranger's wagon wheel on the road out of town, sitting up a night with a sick neighbor's cattle, never once mentioning it afterward. He carried that belief into Red Creek that morning without knowing it was about to be tested in front of the entire town at once. Near the old courthouse, a crowd had gathered around a trader's wagon, and Amos slowed his horse to see what held their attention. Beside the wagon stood a young Apache woman, wrapped in a thin, faded blanket against the cold, dust from days of hard travel still clinging to the hem of her dress. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid in places, and her hands were reddened from the wind, but she carried a stillness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than exhaustion, chin level, eyes lowered but never afraid, as though she had already decided that whatever this crowd of strangers thought of her in the next few minutes would not be permitted to touch who she actually was underneath it. The trader raised his voice to the gathered onlookers. No one wants the trouble of another mouth to feed. Winter's near. Every extra mouth means less food for your own family this year. Heads nodded along the street in quiet agreement. No one stepped forward to offer for her. A few men laughed under their breath. The small, ugly laugh of people, relieved that someone else's misfortune was not theirs to solve that particular morning. A cluster of women near the courthouse steps drew their shawls tighter and turned their faces away, murmuring to one another behind gloved hands. And even the town preacher, passing on his way to the church with a bundle of firewood under one arm, kept walking without slowing his stride. It was not cruelty exactly, not in most of them. It was the particular, exhausted selfishness of people who had convinced themselves there was nothing left to spare, and who had learned, over 2 hard seasons, that looking away was easier than admitting it. Amos noticed something the rest of the crowd did not. While every other eye on that street stayed fixed on her clothing, her posture, the pity or the plain contempt written across so many faces, the young woman's own eyes were moving steadily across the mountains beyond the rooftops, reading the ridgelines, the color of the clouds gathering low behind the peaks, the way the wind bent the tall grass at the far edge of town. She was not looking at the people gathered to judge her. She was reading the land, the way another person might read a letter from someone they trusted completely. $2, the trader finally announced, more to end an awkward silence than out of any real expectation that a coin would land in his palm. No one moved, no one spoke. Amos counted the coins in his pocket from the grain he had just sold. Not much, but enough, and stepped forward before he had fully decided to. "I'll pay it." A ripple of disbelief passed through the crowd, followed quickly by laughter, sharper this time than before. A voice carried down the street, loud enough for half of it to hear. Amos Redfield's finally lost his senses. Del Caro, a rancher with land twice the size of Amos's and an opinion for every occasion, leaned against a post and grinned at his neighbors. $2 for a burden you'll be feeding all winter. That's a fine trade, Amos." The crowd laughed again, and this time Amos let it roll past him without turning his head. He had made his decision before Del finished the sentence, and nothing spoken on that street was going to unmake it now. He crossed to the young woman slowly, the way a man might approach a spooked horse, hands loose and open at his sides. "You don't have to be afraid of me. My name is Amos." She studied his face for a long moment, as though weighing something far larger than the $2 still warm in the trader's palm. "My name is Winona." They walked out of Red Creek together, while the laughter followed them past the last building, and out onto the open road, and neither of them looked back once. The road out to Amos's spread ran 3 quiet miles through scrub and low hills, and for most of it neither of them spoke at all. The only sounds the crunch of frost-hardened ground underfoot, and the distant complaint of a hawk circling somewhere above the ridgeline. Amos found himself matching his pace to hers without deciding to, and somewhere along the 2nd mile he realized he had stopped rehearsing what he might say to a stranger and started simply walking beside a person, which felt, to his own quiet surprise, like an entirely different thing. At the top of the hill overlooking the town, Winona stopped and turned toward the mountains, where dark clouds had begun gathering low over the peaks, and a cold wind carried the unmistakable, mineral smell of coming snow. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely above the wind itself. "The winter will be harder than they believe." Amos looked at her, then at the mountains, and made no reply at all, but he carried those words with him for a long time afterward, longer than he expected to. The ranch Amos brought her to was smaller and plainer than anything she had likely imagined on the walk out of town. A sturdy cabin with a stone chimney, a weathered barn missing several shingles, fences that leaned in places where the posts had gone soft with rot, and a woodpile far too small for the season that lay ahead of them both. If Winona was disappointed by any of it, she gave no sign. She simply took it in the way she had taken in the mountains an hour before, reading it, understanding it, already turning over in her mind everything it would need before the year was through. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, Amos woke to find her already outside, carrying 2 full buckets of water up from the creek. He crossed the yard quickly and lifted one from her hands before she could set it down herself. "You didn't have to do that." She met his eyes without hesitation. "In my family, everyone works before the sun greets the earth. I would not know how to be idle in a house that needs care." From that morning forward, she worked without ever being asked, mending blankets worn thin at the seams, sweeping the cabin floor, sorting the tools scattered loose across the barn, gathering fallen branches for kindling on every walk she took. By the end of the first week, The ranch was more orderly than it had been in the 3 years since Amos's father passed and left it to him alone. Amos noticed and kept his silence because he did not yet know how to name what he was starting to feel about it, even privately to himself. In the evenings, once the chores were finished and the fire was banked low for the night, Winona would sometimes share memories of her grandfather, an old man who had raised her after her own parents were lost to a hard sickness winter when she was small. He had taught her to read tracks pressed into soft ground, to know a healthy stream from a poisoned one by the plants growing along its bank, and to listen to the land the way other people listened, for a trusted neighbor's warning at the door. He used to tell me the land never lies to anyone willing to sit still long enough to hear it. Most people never sit still long enough. Amos, who had worked this ground his entire life without once thinking to simply listen to it, found he had no good answer for that, only a growing suspicion that she was right, and that he had been missing something important for years, without ever noticing the gap. One quiet evening she asked him, almost shyly, if he wanted to know the word her grandfather's people used for the mountains behind Red Creek. When Amos nodded, she taught it to him slowly, correcting his clumsy first attempt with a small, patient smile that he found himself thinking about long after the lesson ended. He never managed to say it quite the way she did. She never once made him feel foolish for trying. More than once, Amos caught her standing at the edge of the yard, in the last light of evening, facing east toward country neither of them ever named out loud, her expression somewhere he could not follow her. He never asked what she was thinking in those moments, or who she might be missing, sensing that some things were not his to ask for, only to leave room for. She always came back from those quiet minutes the same way, steadier, gentler, as though the looking itself had settled something in her, and returned to whatever chore waited without a word about where her mind had traveled. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned, but both had come, quietly, to rely on. Mornings began with the water and the stock, afternoons with whatever the ranch demanded that week. Fence, firewood, the slow, methodical work of readying a small spread for a season that showed no mercy to anyone unprepared for it. In the evenings, over a simple supper Winona had usually improved without being asked to, the two of them talked more than Amos had talked with another living soul in the 3 years since his father died. She asked him about the ranch, about the cattle prices in town, about why a man who worked as hard as he did still counted every coin twice. He asked her, carefully, about the plants she gathered on her walks, about the stories her grandfather used to tell, around a fire not so different from the one warming their own small cabin. Neither of them rushed the other toward answers they were not ready to give. One cold Saturday, mending the last stubborn section of the barn roof together, Amos handed shingles up to her one at a time while she nailed them into place with a steadiness that surprised him, given she claimed never to have done the work before. My grandfather said a person can learn anything with their hands if they are willing to fail at it in front of someone patient enough to wait. She glanced down at him from the ladder, something almost playful in her expression, for the first time since he had known her. "Are you patient, Amos Redfield?" He found himself laughing. A real laugh, the first one that Barn had heard in longer than he could remember, and admitted that he supposed he would have to be. By the time the light failed that evening, the roof no longer leaked anywhere, and neither of them mentioned how much longer the work had taken, with two people trading jokes instead of one man working in silence. One afternoon, while helping repair a section of fence along the eastern boundary, Winona knelt beside a patch of dry grass and lifted a scatter of seeds from the ground, turning them slowly over in her palm. "The birds have gathered these far earlier than they should." She nodded toward the horses grazing in the near pasture, their coats already thickened into a heavy winter shag, weeks before Amos would have expected it of them. Overhead, a formation of geese cut low across the gray sky, close enough that he could hear the beat of their wings. "My grandfather taught me that the land speaks before the danger arrives, if a person is willing to listen for it. I believe this will be the hardest winter in many years, harder than anyone in that town remembers living through." Amos had spent enough seasons around cattle, weather, and lean years to know the difference between superstition and genuine understanding, and he had lived on this frontier long enough to respect anyone who truly read the land, instead of merely guessing at it and hoping to be right. He did not question her. He changed his plans instead. Over the weeks that followed, he stacked every log he could split, climbed up and repaired the barn roof board by board, filled every water barrel he owned to the brim, salted and stored what meat he could afford, dried what grain he could spare from selling, and gathered every spare blanket in the house, folding them into a growing pile by the hearth that made the small cabin feel, for the first time in years, like it was being prepared for instead of merely endured. Word of his preparations spread through Red Creek quickly, the way word of anything unusual spread in a small town with little else to talk about that season. Del Caro rode out one afternoon under the pretense of borrowing a tool he didn't actually need, mostly to see the strange sight for himself. He found Amos loading firewood onto a sled and laughed out loud. "You spent $2 on a stranger, Amos, and now she's got you hiding from a winter that hasn't even arrived yet. What's next? She going to tell you when the sun'll rise?" Amos only smiled, set another log onto the sled, and kept working. He had stopped needing Del's approval a long time before that morning, and standing there in the cold with a woodpile finally tall enough to trust, he found he needed it even less now. A week later, Amos rode into town for one final load of salt before the roads turned bad for good, and found Del loading his own wagon outside the general store, his expression a good deal less certain than it had been at the ranch. "Sky's been strange all week," Del admitted, not quite meeting Amos's eye. "My knee's been aching worse than usual, too, and it never lies about weather coming." He did not ask outright whether Amos still believed what his Apache woman had told him. He did not need to. Amos only nodded, loaded his own salt, and rode home without saying more than the weather itself required. But he noticed, riding out of town that afternoon, that two other ranchers were quietly stacking extra wood of their own, glancing toward the mountains the way a man glances at a debt he has started to suspect is real. By the third week of November, the ranch was as ready as one small spread could be made ready, for a winter no one else in Red Creek believed was coming early or hard. Still, Winona watched the sky each evening the way another woman might watch a rider on the horizon, waiting for the day it would finally confirm what she had already promised him weeks before. One evening she stepped out onto the porch and stood very still, watching an enormous bank of black cloud roll slowly over the peaks to the west, swallowing the last of the daylight whole. Amos came to stand beside her, following her gaze toward the mountains. "It begins tonight." There was no fear in the words, only certainty, the calm of someone simply reading the time off a clock only she could see. She was right before midnight. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a scream within the hour, followed by snow that did not fall so much as a tack, sideways, blinding, relentless, against every board and window of the cabin. By the time the sun should have risen the next morning, the trail into town had vanished beneath drifts taller than a man, and the creek that ran past Amos's cabin had frozen solid enough to cross without a single crack sounding underfoot. For 3 days the storm did not let up. Snow piled against the north wall of the barn until it reached the eaves. The wind never stopped clawing through the gaps in the fence line, and twice Amos went out into the worst of it just to be certain the animals still had feed and water, each trip out and back leaving him half frozen and, for the first time in his life, deeply grateful for a woman who had known enough to make him ready. Inside the cabin, Winona kept the fire fed with a steady, unhurried patience, checking the seals around the windows, boiling water for warmth long before anyone needed to ask for it, moving through the small space the way she had, reading the mountains that first cold morning, attentive, unafraid, already 3 steps ahead of whatever the storm intended to do next. Amos found himself watching her more than the fire some nights, struck by how little of what she carried in her looked like fear, even with the whole world screaming outside their door. In Red Creek, the ranchers who had laughed loudest now paid the steepest price for it. Families who had delayed stacking wood, who had trusted that winter would arrive ordinary because it always had before, found their fuel gone and their pantries bare by the second day of the storm. At Amos's ranch, the fire never went cold. The animals stayed fed. The water never ran short. Winona's warning and Amos's willingness to act on it when an entire town would not had bought them something no amount of money could purchase that autumn. 3 days of safety while a whole town shivered 3 miles away in the dark, wondering how it had come to this so fast. On the fourth morning, the wind finally eased into something closer to stillness, though the cold remained bitter enough to sting exposed skin within minutes of stepping outside. Amos climbed the ridge behind his cabin and looked toward town. Where dozens of chimneys should have shown steady curls of smoke against the pale sky, he counted only a handful. "We have to help them." He was already turning back toward the barn before the words had finished leaving him. Winona was gathering supplies before he had reached the door. Blankets, dried meat, sacks of grain, and a small collection of herbs she had gathered and dried through the autumn, without ever explaining why. Herbs Amos now understood she had been saving exactly for a morning like this one. They loaded a sled behind Amos's strongest horse and set out for town along a route that no longer resembled any road at all, every familiar landmark buried under drifts that had reshaped the whole valley overnight. Twice during that journey, Winona's hand shot out and stopped Amos before he could guide the horse forward. "Not there." She nodded toward a stretch of the frozen creek that looked, to Amos's eye, no different from any other stretch of it. The ice runs thin where the current bends beneath it. Moments after they diverted around it, the ice groaned and gave way exactly where they would have crossed, dark water welling up fast through the widening crack. The second time, she stopped him at what looked like solid snowpack near a shallow gully. The wind leaves different marks where the ground beneath is soft. She pointed to faint ripples in the drift that Amos would never have noticed on his own in 100 crossings. They went around. Amos stopped asking her to explain after that. He simply trusted her, the same way he had trusted her about the winter itself, weeks before it ever arrived. When they finally reached Red Creek, the town Amos found bore little resemblance to the busy, wary place he had left days before. Shelves in the general store stood empty. Firewood piles that should have lasted the season had been burned down to nothing in 3 desperate days. Children huddled close to whatever fire their families could still keep lit, wrapped in every blanket the household owned, their breath fogging even indoors. The very people who had laughed at Amos in the street now watched in silence as he and Winona unloaded sled after sled of supplies onto the frozen ground in front of the meeting hall. No one quite able to meet his eyes, and no one laughing at all this time. An elderly woman, Mrs. Hartley, who had lived in Red Creek longer than almost anyone and had buried a husband and more than a few hard winters in that town, took an armful of firewood from Amos with hands that shook, though not entirely from the cold. "You came back for us. After everything this town said to you that morning." Amos nodded toward Winona. "She's the one who knew. I only listened." Down the row of houses, a young mother named Sarah Coyle wept openly when Winona showed her how to seal the draft beneath her door with mud and torn cloth, admitting through tears that she had been ready to give up her own supper for another night just to keep her children fed one more day. An old trapper who had lived alone on the edge of town for as long as anyone could remember let Winona press a cup of the warm herbal drink into his hands and drank it without a word of protest, though he had refused every offer of charity from his neighbors for the better part of 20 years. A knot of children, too young to understand why the grown-ups around them looked so frightened, gathered close to Winona simply because she was the only adult in Red Creek that week who was not too rattled to smile at them, and she taught 2 of the older ones a game with pebbles and string that kept small hands busy and small minds off empty stomachs for the better part of an hour. Their mothers watched from the doorway, grateful, in a way none of them yet had the words for. Winona moved through Red Creek for the rest of that day, and the 2 that followed with a quiet, unhurried competence that steadied everyone she came near. She checked on the elderly one household at a time, brewed her warm drinks over borrowed fires from a small pouch of dried root and bark she had gathered on her walks that autumn, without a single soul in Red Creek knowing what it was for, and showed tired mothers how to keep what little heat they had from slipping out through every crack in an old wall. When a young boy came down with a fever on the second night, it was Winona the family sent for before they thought to send for anyone else. And by morning, the fever had broken under the same quiet attention she had given the fences, the seeds, and the sky. She never once raised her voice. She never once asked for thanks. Fear seemed to loosen its grip on anyone she spent even a few minutes beside, and by the second evening, the same street that had watched her sold for $2 was quietly, almost shyly, grateful to have her walking through it. Even Del Caro, passing her on his way to check his own half-frozen stock, found himself nodding to her instead of past her, an acknowledgement he could not have easily explained if anyone had pressed him on it. On the third morning after the worst of the storm had passed, a rider fought his way into town on an exhausted, half-frozen horse, shouting before he had even reached the meeting hall. His coat was crusted white to the shoulders, and his voice cracked from cold and fear both, and it took the better part of a minute before anyone standing near the hall could make sense of what he was trying to tell them. Several families, 11 souls in all, among them small children, were trapped beyond Eagle Pass. The road that normally connected them to Red Creek had vanished entirely beneath drifts, twice the height of a wagon, and no one who had tried to reach them in the last 2 days had gotten within a mile of the pass before turning back, afraid for their own lives on top of everything else. The meeting hall fell into the kind of panicked argument fear always produces, men talking over one another about impossible routes, about waiting for a thaw that might not come for weeks, about the very real chance that anyone who tried the pass in these conditions would simply add their own names to the list of the lost. In the middle of that noise, someone turned to Winona, and afterward no one could quite agree who had turned first. And for the first time since she had stood beside that trader's wagon, no one in the room questioned whether she belonged there. She crossed to the map pinned against the wall and studied it a long moment before her finger came to rest on a curving line behind the pass, a route so narrow and unremarkable that most of the men in that room had never once noticed it existed. There is another way. It is longer. Her finger traced the line slowly. But the hills here shelter it from the worst of the wind, and the wind is what kills, more than the cold itself ever does alone. My grandfather showed me this valley when I was a girl. Travelers rarely find it, because they search for the fastest road instead of the safest one. The snow will lie lighter there. I am certain of it. A long silence followed. Del Caro, of all people, was the one to finally break it. How certain? There was no mockery left in his voice at all now, only the plain, frightened question of a man whose neighbors' lives hung on the answer. As certain as I was about the winter. Amos stepped forward before anyone else in the room could speak. We came this far trusting her. I'm not about to stop now. I'm going, and I'll follow wherever she leads. One by one, other men in the hall began to volunteer. Del among them, along with 3 ranchers who had barely exchanged 2 words with Amos in months, and one who had never spoken to him before that morning at all. They set out before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, Winona leading the way on foot beside Amos's horse, reading the shape of the drifts and the marks the wind left across the snow, the way another person might read a well-worn trail in broad daylight. The hidden valley proved exactly as she had promised, the wind dropping to almost nothing the moment the party entered its shelter, the snow shallow enough in places to see the frozen grass beneath it. The men behind her rode in a silence that had nothing to do with exhaustion, several of them glancing at one another as the valley's steep, sheltering walls rose up on either side, plainly understanding for the first time just how easily every one of them could have died, searching for a road that had never been the right one to begin with. It took the better part of the day, the light thinning fast behind gray cloud, but by late afternoon, they reached the trapped families at last, half frozen and nearly out of hope, huddled together inside a line shack that had barely kept the worst of the storm out. A young father clutched his 2 children so tightly that his arms had gone numb from the effort, and an old woman among them wept when she saw the sleds crest the last rise of the hidden valley, certain until that very moment that no one was coming for any of them at all. There was no time for long explanations once the party arrived. They wrapped the coldest children in every spare blanket they carried, loaded the weakest onto the sleds, and started back the same way they had come, retracing Winona's path through the sheltered valley while the light failed fast behind the western ridge. Partway through the return crossing, the wind rose again without warning, whipping loose snow into a blinding curtain that erased the valley's edges in seconds, and for one long, silent stretch, even the men who trusted Winona most held their breath, unable to see more than an arm's length ahead of the sled in front of them. She never slowed. She kept her hand against the flank of the lead horse and her eyes on marks in the snow only she seemed able to read, and within minutes, the wind eased just enough for the shape of the sheltering hills to reappear ahead of them, exactly where she had promised they would be. It was full dark by the time the last of them stumbled back through the streets of Red Creek, but every single person who had left with the search party that morning, and every soul they had gone out to find, walked or was carried home through the door of the meeting hall alive. Mothers who had spent the day fearing the worst ran into the street without their coats to count faces by lantern light, and for a long while, no one in Red Creek said anything at all, too grateful to trust their own voices with it. The church bell rang out over Red Creek that night, again and again, until half the town had gathered in the cold just to hear it, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the sound carried only good news. Spring came slowly to Red Creek that year, the way it always did after a hard winter, the snow retreating first from the south-facing slopes, then from the fields, until the creek ran high and clear again, and the first green haze of new grass spread across the pastures, like something the land had been holding its breath over for months. But something in the town itself had changed that no thaw alone could fully explain. Neighbors who had spent the autumn counting their own grain twice before helping anyone else now worked side by side without ever being asked, repairing fences, sharing seed, trading labor for labor, the way the town's oldest residents remembered it being done, a generation before harvests turned lean, and fear turned people inward. No one waited anymore for someone else to ask them for help. They simply gave it, the way Amos and Winona had given it that winter, without waiting for thanks in return. The general store kept its doors open later again. The church social returned that spring for the first time in 3 years, and this time no one skipped it, and no one whispered about who could or could not afford to attend. On a clear afternoon in late spring, the people of Red Creek gathered in the town square for what the mayor called, simply, a day of thanks. Nearly everyone came, Del Caro among them, standing near the front instead of at the back with his usual sharp comments held, for once, entirely in check. The mayor stood at the top of the courthouse steps with Amos on one side and Winona on the other, and when the crowd finally quieted, he did not need to raise his voice to be heard clearly across the square. Last autumn, most of us in this town judged a woman without ever knowing the truth of who she was. We looked at her circumstances and decided we already understood her worth. We were wrong, badly wrong, and it took the hardest winter this town has seen in a generation to teach us that every life carries value we cannot always see at first glance, and that wisdom can come from places we never expected to find it. Mrs. Hartley stepped forward then, carrying a folded quilt she and the other women of Red Creek had spent the spring evenings sewing by lamplight, squares of blue and gold stitched into the shapes of mountains, rivers, and open fields, the very land Winona had spent that hard winter reading in order to save them all. She placed it gently into Winona's hands. This is so you will always know that you have a home in Red Creek. Whatever else may come, wherever else you go, you have a home here. Amos had brought something of his own that afternoon, small enough to fit in one closed hand, a river stone he had found and smoothed himself over the winter. The shape of the mountain ridge behind the ranch worked carefully into its face, with nothing but patience and a pocket knife. He had not planned to give it to her in front of the whole town, but when the moment came, he found he did not want to wait for a quieter one, and he pressed it into her free hand without a word, just as Mrs. Hartley placed the quilt into the other. Winona looked down at the small carved stone for a long moment, then up at him, and whatever passed between them in that look needed no town square to understand it. Winona held the quilt for a long moment, her fingers tracing the stitched line of a mountain ridge, much like the one she had studied that first cold morning outside the trader's wagon, back when no one in that square had known her name. This land belongs to anyone who chooses kindness. When we care for one another, the way this town has learned to, we become stronger than any winter that comes for us. Amos stood beside her through all of it, close enough that anyone watching could see plainly what had grown quietly between them across that hard season, never spoken of loudly, not yet given a name in front of the whole town, but unmistakable all the same in the way he watched her while she spoke, and in the way she leaned, just slightly, toward him when the crowd pressed close around them both. Afterward, while the square slowly emptied and the last of the afternoon light settled gold over the rooftops of Red Creek, The two of them walked back toward the edge of town together. Unhurried, the quilt folded carefully over Winona's arm, neither of them in any rush to say goodbye to the day. He would tell people, later, that the $2 he spent that gray autumn morning were the finest trade he ever made in his life. Not because of what he gained, exactly, though he gained more than he ever expected to, but because of who he became across the year that followed, and who Red Creek slowly, stubbornly, became alongside him. The years that came after were not without their own hardships. The frontier rarely allowed anyone that kindness for long, but Red Creek never again let a stranger stand unclaimed and unwanted beside a trader's wagon, while the town looked the other way. Newcomers who arrived with nothing were fed before they were questioned. Families who fell on hard luck found firewood on their porch before they ever had to ask for it aloud. And every year, when the first true cold of autumn swept down off the mountains, someone in town would tell the story again, to whichever children were young enough to need telling, of the $2 trade that saved them all, and of the woman who taught an entire frontier to listen to the land, and to each other, before it was too late to matter. If stories like Winona's mean something to you, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a member of this channel. It is a small thing, and it helps keep stories like this one coming for the next person who needs one. For a long time afterward, the people of Red Creek passed down the story of the quiet rancher who followed his conscience into town on an ordinary morning, and of the woman everyone else had rejected who carried, inside her, the knowledge that ended up saving them all. It survived not as a story about pity, and not as a story about charity, but as a story about what a town discovers about itself the moment it finally stops deciding a person's worth before it has bothered to learn their name, and about a rancher and a rejected woman who, between them, showed an entire frontier that the measure of a person was never what they cost, but the good they carried inside them all along.